Hi, everybody. My name is Nick Gonella. I'm a computer major. I'm in the process of transferring. And I want to talk to you a little bit about cryptocurrency, putting the current back in currency, because this is a new technology. Let's hear it for that joke. So, on today's docket, basically we're going to start with a little bit of quick background knowledge, just the basics you need to know to understand Bitcoin, and the bulk of the talk today is going to be on implementation. I want to let you guys know what goes on under the hood with Bitcoin, why is it able to do what it does, and then I'm going to finish it up with a couple social repercussions. So I'm just going to say this now, please ask questions. We're going to be going through this, not quickly, but we're going to be going through a lot of material. So if you have any questions, put up your hand. I love answering questions. All right, so here are our backgrounds. The first thing I want to talk to you about is something called hashing. Now, hashing is basically this idea where you can take this function. An example, in Bitcoin, you use SHA-256, and you put into this function a bunch of bits, a bunch of any random data. And out of that function comes the data's signature, basically a random string of letters and numbers that no matter how many times you put that same data into this function, you will get the exact same signature. But if you put anything else into that function, you will get a different signature. So no two pieces of data have the same signature. You get the same signature every time. And most importantly, you cannot tell what the data is from the signature. So if, for example, I put in 12 into SHA-256 and it comes out as ABCD, you can't tell that I got 12 from ABCD. I mean, you can in this example, but everything's way more complicated in the real world. It's much longer. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is asymmetric encryption. We've had a couple talks about this in the past, about different styles of it. But in a nutshell, it's this idea of normally when you encrypt something, the same password encrypts and decrypts something. So for example, if I have my message is hello, I encrypt it with the password 12. I then decrypt it with the password 12, and I get back hello. That's symmetric encryption. Asymmetric encryption is when you have two different passwords, one that encrypts and one that decrypts. And the benefit of that is you can tell everyone your encrypting password, and it doesn't matter. Only you have your decrypting password. So anyone can encrypt something to you, but only you can decrypt things to you. Does that make sense? Now, that's encryption. But there's also this thing called signing. And signing is sort of using the system in reverse. It's the idea of, I'm going to encrypt something with my... Now, the key that encrypts is called a public key. And the key that decrypts is called a private key, because you make your public key public, you keep your private key private. Signing is this idea of, I'm going to encrypt something with my private key. And then everyone else in the world can decrypt it with my public key. And what that basically says is the only person who could have created that material is me. Because the only way you could get material that's decryptable with my public key is if it was encrypted with my private key. I think I said that. Yeah. You can only get material that's decryptable with my public key with my private key. So there's this way of authenticating and making sure that I'm really me. And that's really important for Bitcoin because you want to have a way to authenticate without saying, oh, hi, I'm Nick Gonella. I'm buying, what? Moving on. So why use cryptocurrency? Much crypto. Money is really useful. The invention of money has allowed us to progress through civilization. Now I don't need to take my goats to the farmer's market when I want to get a tri-tip sandwich. I can just bring them $5. But I'm scared of everyone. Like, everybody. Anyone who has money could make up the fact that they have more money. I have a 20, but maybe they counterfeit another 20, and now I have twice as much money. Or they could try to double spend money. They could try to spend $20, and then say, oh, no, I still have that $20, and spend it again, and then I don't get my money. So I can't trust people to keep money. I also can't trust governments. We can talk about why that is in another talk. But basically, I don't trust governments. Because normally in something like the US currency system, the way that you avoid people being evil is by saying, okay, well, the government will make sure that people don't create money. Counterfeiting is illegal. And the government will make sure you don't double spend money by putting notes on every bill and checking every bill that it's not the same. So Bitcoin solved this problem where I want to use money, but I don't want to have to trust anyone around me. And we're going to use Bitcoin for these reasons. It was the first to come out, it's one of the most popularly known, but more importantly, it's the best documented and the easiest to explain. And best documented is an abuse of the term. This is not well documented at all. This was a lot of my break. I have friends, definitely. There are other things like Dogecoin, which is this picture, Dagcoin, different implementations of it that make little tweaks on this, but the Bitcoin gives you the basic formula for how cryptocurrency works. So, at the heart of everything is transactions. Now, the transaction is the idea of sending Bitcoin from one person to another, because in actuality, you can't have a Bitcoin. A Bitcoin isn't something that exists. If I say I have 12 Bitcoins, what that actually means is I have access to a bunch of transactions that allow me to use 12 Bitcoins. Now, what a transaction is actually just a list of inputs and outputs. For example, if you look at this picture, say you start with 10,000 to 100,000 Satoshis, and a Satoshi is a unit of Bitcoin. It's 1 million Satoshis is 1 Bitcoin. Because Bitcoins are really, really valuable. They're like $1,000 each. So you need to be able to divide them up. So let's say I start with 1,000 Satoshis. Now, in this first transaction, that's the input, and then I spend 40K on this transaction and 50 on this transaction, and then 30. And so what happens is you have this, Bitcoin is actually just a giant chain of transactions of people sending these virtual currency from one person to the next in exchange for goods and services. Now, at the end of any chain of transactions, you'll have these things called unspent transaction outputs. And that's your money. So at the end of this transaction chain, I retain 20,000 plus 10,000. So I have one transaction with 20,000 Satoshis and one with 10,000 Satoshis. And so through this chain, I've spent the Bitcoins on who knows what. No one will ever know what. Oh, oops.
Regular problem.
Lord of Turtles!
So you have this chain of transactions that ultimately end up in being able to spend this money. Now, let's talk about receiving Bitcoin. So let's say that Alice is going to send some Bitcoin to Bob. Maybe she's bought a nice chair from Bob, and now she wants to pay him. So the way it all starts is Bob will generate a new public and private key. Now these are the encryption keys that we talked about, the public key being the one you give to people, the private key being the one you retain. So, and just as a little side note, Bitcoin standard requires that you use ECC for this, and if any of you want to know about ECC, you should watch my talk from last year about it, but basically you can just think of it as the explanation I gave of public key and private key cryptography. But if you're interested in more in depth, go check it out. It's on the White Hat YouTube. So, Bob generates his new public and private key. He then does that process called hashing of the public key. Now, if, as you recall, this is you put the public key into the function and it returns a string of letters and numbers that is unique to that key, but you cannot reverse that key from. And the reason you do this is because ECC is still a relatively new technology. And the idea is, if we find out that ECC is breakable, then if we are able to break it, then all your transactions in the past don't reveal your public keys. Only the hashes are revealed. So if we do break it, people can't then go rewrite every transaction that's ever happened. Your money is still safe. You just need to switch to a new standard for future transactions. So it's this little safeguarding mechanism. So now Bob has generated his hash, and he's going to send that to Alice. And it's Alice's, and that's sent in the form of an address. Basically, an address is just that hash that I mentioned, plus a couple pieces of metadata, like when the hash was created and how long it is, so that the computer can handle it. So once this address is sent to Alice, Alice can generate a new transaction. Just like one of these, Alice would create, for example, transaction 0. Alice can create this new transaction and specify, all right, what does someone need in order to use this transaction? Now, normally, that's the private key. So Alice will set up a script such that when someone inputs their private key, it unlocks the transaction and allows someone to use it. Now, this is similar to the process of signing that I explained earlier, that idea of you verify that the person is that person because they have their private key and no one else does. Now, finally, once a transaction has been created, it's broadcasted to the whole network. You want to tell everyone every time you buy something. It's like Facebook, but with your money. But it's okay, because the only thing in that transaction is this address. And because you can't go backward for it, no one knows. All that we know is money went from one place to another place. We don't know whose money or who the money was going to, except the people involved in the transaction. Make sense? What's up?
You know the amount?
You can tell the amount by looking at prior transactions. So I can tell that 4,000 was sent here by looking at this transaction. I can tell that 4,000 was put into transaction 1. So you can tell the amount, yes. Anyone else? What's up?
So those transactions, is it one large transaction that's being split into multiple parts for security, or is it multiple small transactions?
No, each one of these is a different transaction. A transaction is moving money from one person to another person. So these are all each different transactions, different instances of Bitcoin changing hands. What's up?
And you can tell the money thing, you can tell how much went where by using your private key to sign and look at the transaction, and it'll tell you how much was spent, or...
So with a transaction, even with your private key, all you can tell is that, yeah, this money went to me. You can't determine where it came from except for the address, which has no traceability. You can only tell, with your private key, you can say, this money came to me. Without the private key, you can't tell where the money came from or where it's going to. That's the whole crux of this system, the security of it. So we've received some Bitcoin. Bob's received some Bitcoin, and now he wants to go buy a toaster. He sold his chair, and now he wants to go buy a toaster. So he's going to send some Bitcoin. Here I have a little cutout of a transaction. Now, let's say that Bob got 0.5 Bitcoins, but the toaster is going to cost 0.8. So what he can do is have multiple transactions in. So similar to, again, this picture, you can have, oh, actually, that doesn't happen in this picture. Never mind. Well,
No, the last one.
on the last one?
Right.
Yeah, so similar to this, you can have multiple transactions input into one. So if you need to spend more money than just came from one transaction, you can do that. Now, here we have 3 inputs, 3 of Bob's different transactions, and each of those transactions, he's going to sign it with his private key so that he can activate the transaction, then hash the entire transaction, turn it into a string. And what that allows him to do is put that string into the new transaction, because it's Bob's job to create the transaction and fill it with inputs. Now, these inputs allow people to verify that money went from the first transaction to the second, but doesn't allow you to go backwards. So again, it's that forward security in case ECC gets broken or in case one transaction is leaked, the rest of the chain is still safe. So Bob's going to amass his different transactions that he has access to. Then, just like he did with Alice, he's buying the toaster from Charlie. He's going to get Charlie's going to send Bob his address, his public key hash, and from that, Bob can create the ownership conditions. Now, the ownership conditions are the script that someone needs to go through in order to access it. And again, we're going to assume that Bob creates a standard private key ownership condition. So what that means is this new transaction has been created, and whenever Charlie uses his public key, he can sign it, activate it, and spend it on whatever he wants to. Using his private key. Charlie can use his private key to spend it. Bob, at this point, once he's created the transaction, has no hand in it. Once he's created and broadcasted the transaction, he cannot control that Bitcoin anymore. It's gone. It's now in Charlie's control. Similar to how if I give Max $20, I now have no control over where that $20 goes. So, now, the one thing that you might have in mind is, well, transactions can only be spent once. So what if you have a situation where you need change? For example, if we're buying a 6 Bitcoin toaster again, but I only have a 3 Bitcoin and a 4 Bitcoin transaction. Well, I don't want to send him an extra Bitcoin. Those things are $1,000. I don't want to overpay that. So instead, a nice little trick you can do is have multiple outputs from a transaction. So you have 6 Bitcoin go to whoever's you're buying the toaster from, and then send 1 to yourself. So that way you can have this concept of change, and you can enforce this concept of not spending a transaction twice. Because whatever you do, once you've used a transaction, you can't use part of it. You have to use all of it at once. And so this change allows you to do that. Because anything not made into change becomes what's called a transaction fee. This is money that's left over in transaction that's given to Bitcoin miners when they mine their transaction. Now, what is transaction mining? Well, actually, it's just a fancy name for verification, because transactions are really easy to create. It takes like 10 seconds. At most, you have to generate a new private and public key. So you could make 1 million fake transactions and then say you have all this money. So you need a way to verify them. And that process is called mining. Now, the way that's done is, remember earlier when I said that you broadcast your transaction once you've created it? So that broadcast is sent to every person in the world who uses Bitcoin. And the people who use Bitcoin, who are miners, aggregate those transactions. And every about 10 minutes or so, they take all their transactions, bundle them together, and put them into what's called a block. And a block is just a big bundle of transactions that's going to be mined or verified. Now, in addition to those transactions, you have 2 parts to a block. You have the transactions themselves and a header with some really important metadata that we're going to go through. In fact, this is a block header. I want to step through each element in this, but first I just want to talk about some of the less important ones. Key the version number. That just makes sure that people are all using the same version of Bitcoin, so you're not trying to exploit it. And the time is just the time that the block is created. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the hash of the previous block. Now, what does that mean, previous block? Well, there is a giant chain of these blocks that has been created, from the initial first transaction block all the way till now. And everyone knows about this. Everyone knows about this giant chain of blocks, and it's called, shockingly, the blockchain. Now, the whole idea behind the blockchain is if everyone knows about this giant chain, if everyone knows about every transaction that's ever happened, if I try to come in and say, no, that transaction is different, but everyone else has a different thing, I'm obviously a liar. So it's this idea of, instead of trusting a centralized system, you trust the majority, because so many different people have this. And so the idea with and how the blockchain is created is, everyone has this chain, and the miners, when they want to create a block, take the hash of the end of this blockchain and put it into their block. Then they start mining. And mining, as we'll go over later, takes a significant amount of time. So it's a race to see who can make the next block the fastest. Whoever makes the next block the fastest publishes that to everyone else and says, hey, I made the next block, we're good. And then that person gets your transaction fees, gets a reward.
So is each block like a hash value then, basically, and you're linking a bunch of ones in essentially a sequence or something?
It's like, you can think of it like a linked list. Each block is linked to the prior block that was created, because each block has a hash of the prior block. Now, another big concept of the blockchain is that longer is better. The idea with this is, let's say that I've spent money in block 3. In block 3, there's a transaction that I spent 25 Bitcoins, but I don't want to have spent my 25 Bitcoins. I want to get those back. So I want to I want to change what block 3 looks like. Well, as I mentioned, hashing is unique. So if I want to change block 3, I got to change block 4. But if I want to change block 4, I got to change block 5. But if I want to change block 5, I have to go on and on to 292,699. I have to recreate everything past where I initially spent money. And so there's an emphasis on, the longer the blockchain is, the more secure your money is. And the deeper your transaction is, the more likely someone won't go back on it. All good? So, the next thing we need to talk about is the Merkle root. Now, if we want to talk about Merkle roots, we got to talk about Merkle trees. This is Steve Urkel for the freshmen here. Maybe I'm old, sorry. No, these are Merkle trees. Merkle trees are just basically, if you take every transaction in your block, and then you pair them 2 by 2. And then you take the hash of those two transactions. Then you take all of those hashes, pair them 2 by 2, and hash them together. And so on and so forth until you end up with one Merkle root, which is the combined hash of every transaction in the block. Now, why is that helpful? Why would you want to combine hash? Well, the idea is, again, when you're creating a block, you don't want to make it so that you can change one transaction inside it. So if any one of these transactions were to change, then this root would be different. So you can very quickly verify that this block is valid by just hashing all the transactions together. It's a quick way to let other people verify your work. Now, what this allows is for payment verification. Now, the other thing this allows for is payment verification. So you have this situation now where you have two types of people. You have miners and regular users. You have the regular users who are just buying and selling things using Bitcoin, and the miners who are aggregating all their transactions and collecting blocks. Now, what you don't want to have is that only the miners can say if a transaction is verified or not. You want to have regular users be able to verify it. And that's able to be done with Merkle trees. Because if you look at this, let's say I am transaction number 3. Let's say that's my transaction and I want to verify. I don't trust that miner. I think he's trying to screw me. So I can grab my transaction 3 and then I can grab all the other roots that my transaction doesn't touch. So for example, here we have transaction D. All I need to grab is transaction C, this hash, and the Merkle root. And if these all hash up together correctly, then I know it. I don't need to go through thousands of transactions and spend a bunch of computational time in which the miner could spend trying to screw me even further. It allows for a further system of trust among the miners. Now, does that make sense? Questions? No. Cool. All right. So the last thing we're going to talk about is the fun part. Well, it's all fun, but this part I like a lot. The bits and the knots. So for this, we're going to talk about mining blocks, because the whole point of mining is that it's not easy to do. If verifying blocks were easy to do, then there'd be no point to it. I can just create my million evil transactions, verify them instantly, and all of a sudden I've taken over all of Bitcoin. But so instead, what you have to do is have something called a proof of work. You have to have some way to show, hey, it took a while. I had to work to make this block, and so it's definitely verified. The way you do that is with something called the hash cache method. It's specifically using SHA-52 squared, which is SHA-52 of SHA-52. So instead of just doing the one hash function, you take the data, put it in the hash function, take what comes out of that hash function, put it in the hash function again, and that's your answer. It takes much longer than the SHA-52 we've been using prior to this. 256, not 652. Numbers are hard. And mining blocks pays out Bitcoin. So the first person to mine a block gets paid the transaction fees that are left over from each transaction, as well as a little something extra for their effort that I'll get into later. But theoretically, mining is possible for everyone, because the hash cache method is actually really simple. And to explain it, we have the hash slinging slasher here. He's going to sling some hashes at us. So here's our header. Pretend this is a Bitcoin header. We've got our past transaction, our Merkle root, our metadata. It's all good. But we also have these two values. We have this. This is, by the way, this is all in binary. So this represents 3, and this represents 1. But down here, now in this one, we have the exact same information, but here we have 2. And in this, we have the exact same information, and here we have 3, on and on and on. Now, because we're changing this last value, the hash is gonna be different every single time. So when we put it through our hash slinging slasher method, we get different hashes. Now, here's where this difficulty part comes in, because the whole idea is we're looking for a hash with at least this many zeros at the start. We want to find a hash, and if we look through, this guy got lucky, and with 2, his block hashed to 3 zeros. Now, in reality, there is no way to predict this. The only way to do this work, is to literally increment your block through from 1 to however high it takes, and try to find a hash that meets this difficulty. It is because of the irreversibility of hashes, you can't just undo things. You need to specifically find a value that you tack onto the end of your block such that it meets this requirement. And because of this, it's a solid proof of work. You can prove, I can say for sure that this person put in the amount of time it takes to find this value. And just as a fun little fact, on average, this takes about 10 minutes. 10 minutes of a computer just running at full speed. If you've ever seen how fast computers do calculations, like, this is not an easy thing to do. Computers don't enjoy doing this, but it makes you money, so they do it anyways. AI. So here we are. We have our hashed transaction. Now, if I'm the first person to find 000380, then I'm the winner. I have created the new block. And I can publish it to everyone, telling them that I am the person who gets the transaction fees. Now, why would we have this proof of work? What's the point of it? As I mentioned, it needs to be difficult to create a block because of something called a 51% attack. Now, I need to talk about this because this is probably the biggest problem with Bitcoin. It's the only eventuality that we don't have a solution for. And that is, if 51% of the computers in the world are using Bitcoin are owned by the same person, maybe some 3-letter agency, I don't know, let's just make up 3 letters, NSB. So if the NSB owns 51% of the computers in the world, then that means they can actually create blocks faster than the rest of the world and rewrite the blockchain. This is incredibly uncommon because this is incredibly unlikely because there are millions and millions of CPUs. Even a big organization like the NSB isn't going to be able to control that many computers. And there is, in fact, actually even a reward system against this, because think of it this way. If I control 51% of the computing power in the world, do I want to rewrite one $20 transaction, or do I want to make all the transaction fees and all the money in the world? So there's actually an incentive system, even if you can do a 51% attack, to just continue on with the system. So that is the closest we have to the one major fault with Bitcoin. So the final thing I want to get, now we're about to get into the social implementations, but oh yeah, what's up?
Wait, what's the incentive?
So the incentive is, if you have 51% of the computing power, then that means you're always going to win the race to create a block. So you should just do that and make a ton of Bitcoins instead of trying to rewrite the blockchain. Like, rewriting the blockchain, if you happen to, like, either a machine goes down or you lose less than 51%, all of your work goes to waste instead of just, like, creating a bunch of new coins. So it's much more efficient and it makes more sense to just create new coins than rewrite the blockchain.
So I was reading kind of on my own with Bitcoin, and they said that it's kind of like a well, and how we're kind of coming to the bottom of the well with the number of Bitcoins we can mine. Is that like different from like creating Bitcoin, or the amount of Bitcoins you can mine off the blockchain, and like kind of where is that limit at, or like how is that limit expressed?
That's an excellent question. So yes, he brings up a good point. Part of the Bitcoin algorithm is this idea that it's like gold or some mineral. The longer Bitcoin exists, the more and more that difficulty I showed you goes up, and the harder and harder it becomes to mine Bitcoins. Now, in addition to this, as time goes on, the amount that the Bitcoins pay just naturally by the algorithm becomes less and less. And the reason for this is ultimately they want to get away from, nowadays, we do have some people who work in mining, but for the most part, most of the mining is done. We've had our gold rushes, all the metals, and now the metals are in circulation. So mining is really more, as in addition to a process of making money, it's also a process of getting Bitcoin into circulation so it can become a valid currency. So yes, the idea with the well is Not quickly, but we are approaching a time where people might just be mining for transaction fees, not mining to create new coins or for things called coin bases.
So it's like diminishing returns.
I think I saw an article that said, I think within the next 2 years, we're going to get to the point where the payout of new Bitcoin is actually going to equal the amount of money it takes to mine that block.
That would be an amazing prediction to make, considering the amount of variability and the amount of variability in the Bitcoin market. But
Not in transaction fees, but just the extra payout that they give when you create a block. Because I think it's supposed to drop from 25 Bitcoin, I believe it is right now, to 12 and a half. Huh? Oh, they already dropped it to 12 and a half?
Drop further, but there's so many variables that go into that that's, that can be a guess, but,
So yes, at some point, Bitcoin mining is going to be just worth it for the transaction fees, not for the coin bases, but it's still going to be, we still need miners because we still need people to verify blocks, so people will continue doing it and continue making money off of it. Cool. Any other questions? So,
do you have any idea how many Bitcoins there are total? Because you were talking about how it gets harder and harder and harder, so eventually it would kind of bottom out. Is there a max Bitcoins? Or a realistic max Bitcoins?
There is a realistic max. It's a number. I don't know it off the top of my head. I don't think anyone knows it off the top of their head because it all depends on when people stop going for coin bases and start just going for transactions. So we don't know what the number is, but there is a realistic maximum Bitcoin. And at that point, it becomes just like dollars, where it's just in circulation. People aren't I guess people are creating and destroying dollars, but they're at the same rate, and that's mostly because dollars get old and icky. Yeah, mostly.
I wouldn't say it's at the same rate.
Well,
A theoretical money system could have them
At the same rate.
Remember, this is a system with no government and no bad people.
What's up, Josh? Another question. Who's issuing the new Bitcoins then? So who originally issued them and who has control over that? Who can't just flood the market and devalue the Bitcoin?
So Bitcoins are actually created by miners. I'll go into this now. I've been mentioning things a couple times called coin bases. Now, a coin base is basically when I mine a block, in addition to all my transactions, I put in my own transaction. I say I have a transaction with no input and one output to Nick Gonella. And if I'm the first person, if the network verifies that I'm the first person, then Bitcoin is created, mined from the ground. Bitcoin is created and put into my wallet. That's where the Bitcoin comes from, and that's why that diminishing return cycle that we've been talking about is here. Because you don't want to just be able to create Bitcoin infinitely. It should get harder and harder and harder as time goes on. So that's why there's no centralized authority to create it or destroy it. It simply comes into comes into existence by the virtue of mining.
Okay, so it's just a single transaction that you can't, fraud to say,
Yeah.
oh, I got 100. It's whatever the fixed current rate is, 12 and a half.
Yes, and with Coinbases, 100 blocks have to be created before you can spend that Coinbase to make sure that it's verified, because you don't want people just randomly creating Coinbases.
But you do bring up an interesting point, because early on, very few people mined a lot of Bitcoin because of that diminishing return curve.
Yeah.
And so there is an effect where a small percentage of people control a large percentage of the Bitcoin.
It's unfortunate. We need to
That
take them
sounds
back.
familiar.
What's up, man?
What exactly is a Coinbase?
So a Coinbase is a transaction that a miner adds on to his block that basically gives him free Bitcoin if he's the first person to create, he or she is the first person to create that Bitcoin. So it's if you remember the picture of the transaction with the inputs and outputs, imagine a transaction with no inputs and just one output pointing to the miner. The software sees that transaction and understands, okay, that's supposed to be my Coinbase transaction. And thus, if the network, now a person can't just say, yes, I am the Coinbase, I did it. The whole network has to, or rather 50% of the network has to verify that they indeed were the first person to do it. And so if that person gets that 50% verification, then the software automatically creates it for them. Where am I losing you at some point? What's up?
I kind of think I get it. But so 50% of the network has to say that you were first?
Yes. You have to verify that I was the first person to create the block.
So they have to verify that you verified something?
Yes. Dude, layers of verification. It's all about that distributed life.
It's hard to generate the solution, but it's easy to see.
Like who verifies?
Like, it's hard to solve a problem, you
The
can just
other
plug that
miners
in
that
and
do,
see, oh.
or is it?
Well, I mean, the other miners basically then, they see your block, they run it through a SHA-56, or a SHA-256, 256, and it comes out as whatever that signature is, and if that signature is below the difficulty, then they can verify it themselves.
So would it give you any kind of prompt or a message or something saying that this has already been mined and that this blockchain basically already exists, that you weren't the first one to create it, or how does the verification work in that sense?
So as soon as you create a block, you send it out to everyone, and there's a specific Bitcoin mining daemon that watches for transactions and blocks on the networks, and will basically, based on its implementation, will pick it up and be like, hey, the block you're working on is currently finished, verify it, and then go do your next block. What's up?
When someone mines for Bitcoins, are they using the same process to find new Bitcoins as they are to verify transactions?
Yes, so the mining of Bitcoins, mining is actually just a fancy term for verifying transactions, and it's called mining because as a side effect of verifying transactions, you get paid Bitcoins.
So it sounds like there's some kind of risk to being part of a new block before another block after that is created. How you might not have a transaction you want to get into the block if it doesn't get to everyone, or if you're mining, you don't happen to catch one of the transactions that gets broadcast.
Yeah, so the idea is that the miners are just, while the miner's creating a new block, they're sitting and aggregating transactions.
But there is a possibility that they miss a transaction that the rest of the world sees.
Yes.
And there's a possibility is there a possibility that if you make a transaction yourself, spend some of yours, it doesn't make it into the block? Or is that?
There is a yes, there is a possibility, but the idea is you should be broadcasting to a majority of the network, and because of redundancies in how the software basically looks at all the transactions and looks at the blocks, at some point a client will pick it up and mine it into a block.
And hopefully that enough clients pick it up and mine it into a block that it is actually true.
Yes.
Right.
That, and if someone missed a transaction, it wouldn't be verified by everyone else, right?
Yeah. What's up?
Part of that whole thing with missing transactions is people use transaction fees like sort of as an incentive for miners to include them in blocks.
Yeah. That's why transaction fees exist. If I put a fat transaction fee on mine, you bet I'm not going to be wanting to, no one's going to want to miss that transaction.
Can you vary the amount of transaction fee that you put?
Yeah, you can control your transaction fee. It's just whatever's left over after the transactions and change.
Okay. So kind of a tip to the people who verify. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So that explains your transaction fees.
Usually, I think the tip percentage right now is, I think it's usually you just give them 5,000 Satoshis. No, 500 Satoshis is the standard tip for anything under $1,000. Honestly, the practicalities of it are, I don't know the formal tipping numbers off the top of my head. They're out there. If you want to come talk to me later about them, I would love to come look them up with you. But I don't know them off the top of my head. What's up?
Do you mine Bitcoin?
Yes. Do I mine Bitcoin? No. Yes, we have an officer last year mined Bitcoin, and yeah, and he did work on Bitcoin, but he was also like a big part of Dogecoin. Cool.
By the way, if you want Dogecoin, I'll give you some.
Sweet, I'll take it. I'm down. Of course. All right. Any other questions? What's up?
This is kind of a random one, but when I was looking into Bitcoin mining, they said that AMD-based GPUs were a lot better for Bitcoin mining over like NVIDIA ones. You can possibly know why, or how the platform would be very fast.
Yeah, it's basically, we're actually going to have another talk that relates to that by our good friend Jonathan, but just briefly touching on that, it has to do with the amount of instructions you can send to a GPU at once to compute simultaneously. AMD is much better at receiving that kind of instruction, the just compute it, like grab it and hash, is much better at that specifically than NVIDIA. NVIDIA is very good at a different set of things that might help with graphics, because ultimately graphics cards are not created for this, they're created for graphics. And then this is just some abuse of the graphics cards. We're like, why are you doing this to me?
They're just huge parallel processors.
Yeah.
And at the same time, that's why GPUs are used instead of CPUs. Like, you can use CPUs to mine, but like,
You're not going to, if you actually are serious about it.
yeah.
Cool. So I'm going to talk about wallet automation, and then I'm going to briefly touch on social implications, just because I think they're cool. But first, any other questions? Awesome. So all of this stuff is really complicated. I don't want to think about it when I'm mining or using Bitcoin, so I have a wallet. Bitcoin wallets are basically just software that does all of this stuff for you. It generates your private keys and public keys. It signs your transactions. It does all this for you. And so you just have to think about buying and selling Bitcoin. Coinbase.com is an example of a digital wallet. This is one of those, it's a website. So if you want trust your stuff on the cloud, you can do that. Alternatively, you can use something called a hardware wallet. That's literally a physical device that stores all of your Bitcoin information. So if you really trust no one else, you can just carry it with you at all times. Don't use anything by the company Trezor, because you can crack those really easily. Our friend Nate here gave a talk about it last quarter on it, or last year about it.
Have they found another exploit for it? Because
The private key thing is still usable. Yeah.
I thought they patched that.
They patched that.
Yeah. Cool. So a wallet is just a piece of software that automates all this process for you. So why would you use Bitcoin? Why would you ever give a shit about this? The first one.
Did you turn it off?
Did the battery die?
Knock the battery out.
No, my computer. There we go. My computer is fine. So some of you, I'm sure, have heard of this. It's called the Silk Road. It was a website back in 2011 that basically used a combination of this anonymous secure currency, Bitcoin, and something else called Tor, which basically almost promises discrete and secure browsing in that no one can tell where you're coming from. And so it allowed people to go to this website anonymously, buy things anonymously, sell things anonymously, and receive them anonymously. So of course it was used for drugs and weapons and all that stuff, but it was this idea of a very pure form of capitalism, this idea of buying and selling purely off the market. And eventually it did come down, though not to the fault of either Bitcoin or Tor. It was because of humans, because humans are a huge part in these things. But this is really what brought Bitcoin to the attention of the world and really brought it to the social light. But y'all don't want drugs or weapons or any of that stuff. You just want to be normal citizens. Why would you need this? So this was my placeholder. This is called Sesame credit. Now, just a quick thing. This was my placeholder for it, but when I actually went to go write this slide, this was really summed up exactly what this is. This is something called Sesame credit. It's a system that China is currently working in pilot, and by 2020, it will be mandatory for all citizens. It's basically a social credit score. The companies in China are so closely integrated that you can have one company that has all your transaction information, all your social networking information, all your geographical location. And based on all that information, it gives you a good citizen score. So if you went and liked the Communist Party's page today, your citizen score goes up. If you bought a video game, you're considered unproductive and your citizen score goes down. Now, so what? It's just a number. But this is used like a FICO score. People are denied jobs, loans, and housing for this score. And in 2020, it will be illegal. In fact, one of the most insidious things, do you know what lowers your Sesame score? Your friends having bad Sesame scores. So if your friends aren't agreeing with the party, you better not hang out with them or you might lose your job. Starting to sound like a place where you might want people to not know what you're buying. If Finally, any questions? This picture makes me ask a lot of questions, mostly about why I found this.
Look up destroy all software.
Yeah, this is a reference to what?
Regarding the Sesame score, I thought it was interesting. What's going to stop them from just saying that buying Bitcoin at all negatively affects your Sesame score?
Well, actually, there is a way to buy Bitcoin anonymously. There are several services that do that. If you want to chat about that, we can later. But you need some Bitcoin, bruh? Yeah, no, there are ways to buy it anonymously. That's more of a transactions market. We're not really going to cover that today. If you're interested, I'd love to come chat with you about it later. That's all I got. Thank you very much.